turn of the year. The days were growing longer, but the cold was more intense. Father said, "When the days begin to lengthen, the cold begins to strengthen." At last, the snow softened a little on the south and west slopes. At noon, the icicles dripped. Sap was rising in the trees, and it was time to make sugar. In the cold mornings, just before sunrise, Almanzo and Father set out to the maple grove. Father had a big wooden yoke on his shoulders, and Almanzo had a little yoke. From the ends of the yoke hung strips of moosewood bark, with large iron hooks on them, and a big wooden bucket swung from each hook. In every maple tree, Father had bored a small hole and fitted a little wooden spout into it. Sweet maple sap was dripping from the spouts into small pails. Going from tree to tree, Almanzo emptied the sap into his big buckets. The weight hung from his shoulders, but he steadied the buckets with his hands to keep them from swinging. When they were full, he went to the great cauldron and emptied them into it. The huge cauldron hung from a pole set between two trees. Father kept a bonfire blazing under it to boil the sap. Almanzo loved trudging through the frozen wildwoods. He walked on snow that had never been walked on before, and only his own tracks followed behind him. Busily, he emptied the little pails into the buckets, and whenever he was thirsty, he drank some of the thin, sweet, icy cold sap. He liked to go back to the roaring fire. He poked it and saw sparks fly. He warmed his face and hands in the scorching heat and smelled the sap boiling. Then he went into the woods again. At noon, all the sap was boiling in the cauldron. Father opened the lunch pail, and Almanzo sat on the log beside him. They ate and talked. Their feet were stretched out to the fire, and a pile of logs was at their backs. All around them were snow and ice and wild woods, but they were snug and cozy. After they had eaten, Father stayed by the fire to watch the sap, but Almanzo hunted wintergreen berries. Under the snow on the south slopes, the bright red berries were ripe among the thick green leaves. Almanzo took off his mittens and pawed away with the snow with his bare hands. He found the red clusters and filled his mouth full. The cold berries crunched between his teeth, gushing out their aromatic juice. Nothing else was ever so good as wintergreen berries dug out of the snow. Almanzo's clothes were covered with snow. His fingers were stiff and red with cold, but he never left a south slope until he had pawed it all over. When the sun was low behind the maple trunks, Father threw snow on the fire, and it died in sizzles and steam. Then Father dipped the hot syrup into the buckets. He and Almanzo set their shoulders under the yokes again and carried the buckets home. They poured the syrup into Mother's big brass kettle on the cook stove. Then Almanzo began the chores, while Father fetched the rest of the syrup from the woods. After supper, the syrup was ready to sugar off. Mother ladled it into 6-quart milk pans and left it to cool. In the morning, every pan held a big cake of solid maple sugar. Mother dumped out the round, golden-brown cakes and stored them on the top pantry shelves. Day after day, the sap was running, and every morning Almanzo went with Father to gather and boil it, and every night Mother sugared it off. They made all the sugar they could use next year. Then, the last boiling of syrup was not sugared off. It was stored in jugs down cellar, and that was the year's syrup.